so it doesn't seem like we have as big of a group after the certificate presentation, but that's okay, because we still have a room full of teachers, a room full of people. I've got about an hour, so I've got some more material I'd love to share with you, and we'll stop around 2 o'clock. So I think that's the plan. So if I go longer than 2 o'clock, just yell at me, and I'll sit down and we'll stop. Alrighty, good, so let's continue with this idea. So we were talking, and Glenn had to leave, unfortunately. He's rushing to Yoremchi to catch a train back to Lviv. It's his only option today, so I'll continue solo from this moment. Alright, so let's continue with this theme of critical thinking, or getting our students to really think about how, and for English, right? A lot of English teachers are in this room, but let's talk about how to have like normal conversations with native speakers, or a job interview, or small talk. These are really important social skills that I think a lot of our students don't get practice with. Yes, we have textbooks, yes, we have like formal English lessons, we teach them, but there's a lot that goes missing that I think our students can learn through some cool exercises. I have an exercise I'd like to share with you here. Now, in English, we have literal meaning of words, and we have emotive meaning of words. And so there's a big difference here. We have the literal meaning, like what the word means, and the emotive meaning, meaning the emotional impact of the word. And there's a lot of things to consider here. I think you've probably heard a lot from Richard about intonation and all these things that are really, really important in regular speech. And I have just a quick exercise that I think is interesting to look at here. If we go back to the slide, thank you. And we have these big differences in ways to say things. Literal understandings of things, emotive ways to understand things. And these are just a few examples that you can work with your students, those of you who teach English, and they can really understand, well, how do native speakers say things politely? What do they mean? What is the intonation, the meaning behind what they're really trying to say, their feeling? And we have some comparisons here. So, to be fired, or laid off, or downsized. Now, what are your impressions here, being fired or being laid off? Is there a difference in how you say these two things? What does it mean? If you say you're fired, what's your emotional understanding of the word? There's probably a reason why you don't have a job anymore, right? Well, why were you fired? What did you do? Did you show up at work? Is there some, I don't know, some assault case, some problem, right? If you say laid off, downsized, different reason, what might this mean? Be more neutral, perhaps.
The downsized was invented by management to make them further away from people. It's one of those terms, there's lots of business terms like this that we use, to make people seem less human, because you don't want to feel bad firing someone. Oh, we downsized. And it's horrible management speak, and I hate it. And it is used a lot. It is used a lot though to sanitize the language.
Absolutely. And this is what people really don't often even say, like people were fired anymore. It's like we do revert to this really kind, polite, non-offensive method of communicating these ideas. But this is what you'll hear, and it's important to know, well, why do these differences currently exist? Even though we hate it, I'm with you, I don't like it either, but this is the culture.
It's also
that's in
much
place.
more prevalent in American English than British English.
It is.
We're a bit more direct with things like that. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that too.
If I try to speak in English about Ukrainian problems, fifth from the bottom will be not such interpretation.
Yeah.
Or this one?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I put this intentionally, I thought of these, I came up with these, and there were a few that I thought intentionally for situations in Ukraine. And some of these are very prominent, I think, if you look at, I mean, again, this idea of like trying to provoke your students a little bit, I think it's a wonderful idea to have them debate these things and have really try to get into it. So we teach Ukrainian students what's happening in this country right now. It's, yes, you don't want to get too political and have things get out of control, but are there important issues you can discuss with your students and they can do meaningful research and prepare for a debate, let's say, and learn how to use some of these words correctly in these phrases. some of these are kind of like they want to trigger some sort of emotional response, and they're a little bit like, well, what if we say they're, what's the difference between calling someone a neo-Nazi, a part of like a nationalist party, or saying someone's a patriot? Are there elements in the middle that both of these cases are true? Perhaps, yeah, absolutely. Do these words have different impacts? You need to explore this world a little bit more with your students through debate, through understanding what these things mean. And it's just, maybe you can structure this into your lessons as a warm-up activity. This is not a complete lesson in itself, but it's just another thing to explore and use with your students. Have them really think and understand and then try to speculate. What are the impacts? What are the, all the little kind of like small opportunities and spaces in terms like these, and see what they can create with it, because it's very interesting. And it's a good approach too, because students, they forget about, again, needing to sound correct and sound like they're put in this box when they're speaking English. But if you speak about something relevant within their country with terms that have different impact, like neo-Nazi, patriot, nationalist, or we have genocide or ethnic cleansing, talking about the history of Ukraine, they will have something relevant to contribute, and they're going to come from a lot of different places on a spectrum. Why not open your classroom up for opportunities like this? It's amazing what you can learn from your students' cultures. And so our classrooms are valuable places, and we can try to use it more for that purpose. Okay, so next slide, please. And let's look at this idea of debate again. I have a game I'd like to show you here. So this thing called the believing game. I think it's a pretty cool game. Has anyone heard of it before? Maybe not just by the title. I'll explain it and perhaps you'll be reminded of it. Okay, so in our classes, let me ask you a question first. Who teaches students who have a tendency to argue? They don't really discuss things in a diplomatic way or a democratic way, or they get at each other, right?
Yeah.
It gets a little bit uncomfortable. Does this happen sometimes in your classes? What are your responses to situations like these when you have to moderate or facilitate these uncomfortable, controversial areas of education? What happens as a teacher?
Leadership gives the students a role. For example, one team should take force, and the other team should take part of the problem, and they have to be just polite, and each one has to represent their ideas, but in turn.
Okay, good. Now,
We have so.
so this is a wonderful idea. Giving your students roles, they know what they're responsible for.
And for example, last time I did debates about the issue was there are too many days off on public holidays. Do you agree or disagree? And they were to give the arguments from the point of view of economists. What the possible impact on economy do you have?
Okay. So this is kind of a good
I
transition.
direct them.
Yeah, because they're speaking from a perspective that's not theirs.
Oh, just we want to have rest, it's good to spend time with our families, and so on.
Is there anything challenging in this? Because we can give our students roles, give them positions in a debate, right? Expect that they collect information, they do research. But where's the challenge here? Let's say we pick a controversial issue. We can give them, let's say, for our example, Larissa and I did this, an experiment with a class. We had 10 controversial issues, a wide variety of things. And we allowed our students to select what controversial issue was the most relevant for them. They voted, they had slips of paper, they came up and put the slips of paper on a desk, and because of their vote, they chose a controversial issue about how social media is currently an addiction. It's a big problem, and the current generation is addicted to social media. And like these ideas, we split them into two teams. We had the affirmative and opposing team. There may or may not be much of a challenge there, but this is what I'm getting at. This believing game, if you give students a prompt and you assign them, you make them, let's try this as an example. Ihor, will you go to the next slide, please? I have a prompt here to continue this idea here. The prompt says, universities are no longer necessary since everything students need to know is available online. Okay? Now, with this believing game here, what I would do if you were my students, I would ask you that this prompt You must believe it, you must defend it, you must say why it's true. I thought of a controversial prompt because we're all university teachers here. We need jobs, right? And we go to universities. This isn't good for us. Who agrees with this? Naturally. Maybe just Richard. Who's against this? Who's opposed to this prompt? Somewhere in the middle. But I think the value of an exercise like this, if I told you that you have to debate this, but you have to defend it, you're taking a different perspective. You have to defend something that you don't believe in, and there's a skill to trying to speak this out, and there's a lot of critical thought. Because oftentimes, and you want to go back, last slide, please. Good. So my point here is that we argue eagerly for our own opinions. We listen to opposing arguments, mainly to find flaws. Where's this person wrong? Where do they disagree with me because I'm right? I'm holding my ground. And when we do, we interrupt and attack them. We're more interested in proving ourselves right, what we already think, in winning the argument, than in considering seriously another viewpoint and continuing to think. This is where the thinking stops, in thinking that we're right. The idea behind the believing game is to suspend judgment. Even if you disagree with this prompt, your university teachers, you disagree, you're suspending your judgment, you're not jumping to conclusions here, but you're really trying to go down a different avenue and find reasons why this is true and why you can defend it. This is where valuable research can happen, and I think we need to kind of, you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, this pyramid of the different words, right? Maybe you can remember a few words from this pyramid. What's at the bottom part of the pyramid? Remember, understand. Are these high levels of thinking? Are these very critical? These are like the most primitive, basic levels, right? Remember, understand, like drilling, things like this. What's at the top of the pyramid? Create, evaluate, analyze, much deeper thinking, much more critical thinking, right? And so we want our instruction to be coming from the top of the pyramid. And like Len said earlier, and I think like Richard said earlier, critical thinking doesn't just start one day. It's not a one-day thing, and we don't just, it doesn't occur without knowing the basics of a subject. We need to learn like the foundation of the subject that we're teaching, but we need to take it far enough to where we have critical thinking happening too. So it's like we have the basics, you go up the pyramid, but we need to address some of these parts of analyzing, creating, and it's important to get there. Okay, so this believing game, I think it's pretty cool because you have a perspective that you obviously disagree with, right? You're naturally opposed to, but then you're forced to think about it and you're forced to defend it in a way that's not comfortable for you, and it's kind of cool to see what's created here.
But is that not cultivating a certain veneer of sincerity and lying? So it's what good lawyers do, or politicians.
It's true. And well, how often can we say that at our jobs we always have the luxury of defending what we truly believe all the time? Like, we don't have that luxury, unfortunately. Right, exactly. Sometimes in our positions, we're made to do things that we don't always agree with. We're made to follow directions that we don't always believe to be the best. But we have to defend it somehow. And these are real-world skills that our students need, and what better place to practice it than in a classroom? So there's value in this exercise because, yes, we get very good at saying things we believe. It's easy to defend. We get this exercise, but take your students out of that bubble and have them really think of something very almost like threatening to them, but think of something that's provocative where they have to like really get out of their shell and speak about something where they can generate some new thought, present it, and then maybe you can break it down about truth and sincerity later. But I've had some success in classrooms teaching this kind of skill, and it's really cool because this is the most critical thinking that I've seen as a result of being produced. Okay, let's see. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now, this prompt, how might you be able to defend a prompt like this? From the previous session we had, from perhaps what Richard said yesterday, what might you say in defense of this? Whether or not you believe it's true, if I gave you the role, you must defend this, you must say that it's true, how could you convince me? what critical thought comes out here?
Practice the humor that's not something that proves the point. But you can't just say, you just can't prove idea if you don't have some features or some facts or some information that is told. Yeah? So the information it just can't be just blah blah blah. Yeah? So if I want to prove something, it should be evident and clear for my opponent. I should convince him. Yeah? So I have to choose some data, some facts, and prove. Look, previous year, for example, there were lots of universities, and nowadays the number of them is shortened. So the tendency is that.
It would take a lot of preparation and effort to prepare something that's logical, that's valid, in order to defend something that you don't believe in.
Yeah,
right?
you just
You have to reach for it, you have to gather
have
it.
to read something.
In Ukraine, up to the present is a good phrase. Without paper, you are back. But with paper, you are not. This is an answer for your problem. For students. If you want to be a man, you must have that diploma. That's why you may study in your university and have your home.
What's interesting as well is I wonder how much this is a test of critical thought as it is a test of somebody's ability to spontaneously talk about
Speak
something.
extemporaneously.
Because I could argue one way or the other, and I'm making it up as I go along with no facts and no research.
Sure.
But if I sound convincing, and this is the politician lawyer thing. This is the
sound
danger.
convincing, you have to know what to talk
No,
about.
not necessarily. If you just happen to be somebody who is talented,
It's skilled, it's true.
at skilled in extemporizing and being spontaneous, you can convince people because that's what politicians and lawyers do.
Absolutely.
So most politicians, do you think Trump knows anything? No, of course he doesn't. But he's very good at twisting things to fit his way. So you could argue for this with no research, no basis, whether you believed it or not, if you have that skill of delivering exactly right for what you want. And that's what we do when you're parents. I lie to my kids all the time. You know, because it's just a lot easier. So you have to make it. Like my child loves Doritos at Christmas, my little 5-year-old. And every time we go past it, and it's not good for him. So every time we go past the shop, I say, no, they haven't got any. Or the shop's closed today. Or it's a holiday, or whatever. We do this all the time. You don't need to do the research. I agree with you to argue it convincing, really convincing. But this is an exercise. This is why I'm not so sure whether it's an exercise in critical thought, or whether it's an exercise in spontaneity of speech and quickness of mind.
Sure. You can use this. I think it's multi-purpose. It depends how you structure this into a lesson. I think if you want to use it for like a debate purpose and have students gather research materials, prepare roles, absolutely yes. But if you have a quick kind of, you want them to speak extemporaneously off the cuff, and there's a real world skill in this, absolutely, because this is what they do in their professions. We can debate whether or not this is a valuable practice long term for citizens who are preparing for the world, but is it important for learning English? Absolutely, absolutely, and I think Richard hit on this yesterday. Our students, when you're communicating something in English, you're opening your mouth, and it's because you want something. This is, if you don't speak English really, but you are successful in buying a bottle of water or like a beer or something, you've gotten something you need that you want. This is kind of like the impromptu variant, I think, of an exercise like this, that if they're defending something that they don't believe, and they have to like kind of stand their ground, and maybe they're dishonest to themselves in trying to do this, but they're going through the exercise because they want to have the best debate possible. They're gaining something here, and it's a skill that they need to use because this is, I think, where language development is huge. This is where it's churning, sort of, and you know what this is. You're teachers, and you've seen it work, and you've done it yourselves. We have 45 minutes or so. There's something I really want to do with the cards that you filled out earlier. I think it's a cool activity here because we have a lot of really good ideas from teachers who've spent years in classrooms. I asked you earlier to fill out the cards that were meaningful, interesting, and interactive. Remember? We have some cards here, and I've noticed this trend sort of in Ukraine a little bit, that we don't have, that's true in the United States to an extent too, but I don't think there are a wealth of opportunities for real quality professional development, for teachers to really meet and share their materials. What works in classrooms, the quality needs to be more at the forefront, how teachers are spending their time in their classrooms. And there are tons of distractions, tons of other things happening with documents, bureaucracy, yes. I'm familiar with this. Same in the United States in a lot of ways too. But if we don't have time, if we don't have encounters to really meet people and talk about what are the best methods and practices, what have we invented for ourselves, for our classes? We're creative people. But why does this culture exist where we don't feel comfortable to share or to steal? I think teachers are great thieves. I think it's absolutely true. And the creative process as a teacher, it never stops. So you have tons of things that you teach, but it's not fun to teach the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. At least not for me, because it's not super interesting, it's not super challenging. I put this slide together earlier today. We had some ideas, and it's like, you kind of learn what works, what doesn't work, what their responses are. But it's important that we use some of the brain power, some of the experience of all the teachers around you, and try to share more of a wealth of information, of practices like this. So we have some really interesting cards that I selected here. I hope people who wrote their ideas on these cards are here, but I'll read the idea from the card, and I'd like this teacher just to expand a little bit more on what they said in how it was meaningful, interactive, or interesting. Because there's a wealth of ideas here, so why not try to actually get some material for what critical thinking is. Okay. Is Larissa here? A visit to a doctor? Who wrote this card? Different Larissa? She left? Okay. But this one said a visit to a doctor and a role play between a doctor and a patient. If Larissa were here, maybe she could expand on how this could be interactive or something like that. Let's go to another one here. Let's see here. Okay, how about Ina? Is English for sportsmen? Video lessons, best basketball players?
For my classes,
So, yeah.
I had English for specific purposes classes, and we had the topic, we have different topics from football, basketball, and after the topic, during the topic, we just watched different video, short video lessons, just video slides, yeah. And students were very impressed because they saw their heroes, yeah, the sportsmen they were in, they just liked them, they just want to be like them, and they were very pleased to find out new information, and the information was new in the way they didn't hear it before. Yeah, they didn't even know that this or that person shooted so many goals, or that some facts about his family. So we just watched the video, we discussed it, and they liked that.
Okay, so we have incorporation of videos in your classes. Could we say that where's the interactive piece of this lesson? Does it sound interactive based upon the description? Where's the interaction? Is it interactive? So
you have different understanding of the problem. Interactive, you may think that it's different technical support or no. But here, understand that interactive is the possibility to speak one with other on different teams, items. Maybe you can tell us what is it interactive in your mind?
sure. So maybe it's important that we have a clear understanding of what interactive means in our lessons, correct?
Yes.
Good, because we have videos
As far as I
incorporated.
understood, I have to use
So let's think about it this way. It's interesting, it's fun for us to collect resources and videos and use them in our classrooms, right? If you're a student in a class and you watch a video and you're able to get some new information about sportsmen or their lives. What more responsibility do your students have from this type of lesson? It sounds very interesting. It sounds like a very interesting lesson. But
They were supposed
how are you giving them more responsibility? What new skills or tasks are you trying to get them to perform? Or are you maybe getting them to
They
create
were
something
supposed to
centralized,
make
generated?
their own project about their favorite sportsman in these or that field,
Okay.
and they presented them.
Okay.
Oh, for example, they presented their the sports they were doing. Yeah, for example, someone played hockey, field hockey, and they presented their game.
Absolutely, I think this would be meaningful. I think it's extremely meaningful. Who else has an example of something that's more interactive? We heard a lot of good examples from these previous.
Using
Richard.
that though, which is I think a really valid and good thing to do, what you could do is you could ask the students to imagine that they're journalists, and this is guys, whoever it is, and then what questions are you going to ask, sort of follow-up questions from this video presentation, so they actually have to think based on what they've heard and seen to use that as a basis for questions, which is, suggests a certain amount of interactivity.
Absolutely, absolutely. And perhaps these could be skills that they could then take out and work with. Maybe your students are from a tourism group or something like this. And
I had the students from the journalist group here I had over, and they made a presentation about our university and their faculty. They went with the camera and microphone around the university and just shot the videos themselves, and then presented it. So if I understand correctly.
no, now I can understand it absolutely. So there's a project behind it, which is a good motivation. And you have your students going out and practicing some journalism skills. You gave them a basis of information from videos, from looking up their favorite sportsman or soccer player, whatever it is. Then this kind of launches into a project where now they're responsible to go out and to create a project, a presentation about the university. It becomes much more interactive in that way. So with the more description there, I could understand the interactive part. Did you want to share what you wrote here, a late entry here? So we have how to edit a movie. This is from George, but what's the interact? You've done this with your class before? Movie editing?
I'm IT teacher. That's why this lesson, this interactive studying is very interesting, not only for me, but for students too. We have some film, some movie, and try to edit something, put the sound on the movie, and so on. And I have the ideas of student, and student have my attention and my opinion about his or their work. That may be the most.
Does anyone else have their students create videos for educational purposes? What have you seen? So when your students create a video and they have to watch themselves speak, they have to create something, and then they know others will be watching it. That's always a fear, but also it's more responsibility to create something good. What do you see when you start to debrief a lesson like this?
Well, they all
What
start
do
by
you see from
thinking
the
it's
student?
terrible.
Of course.
And I'm really sorry, this is awful, you're going to hate it, but they've done it. And then most people actually, they come. And the idea is that I get them to do little video blogs. Just random thoughts as they're walking or jogging or in the gym or whatever. And what it shows them is that because they don't want to have to do lots of takes over and over and over again, they kind of forget about making too many mistakes and they concentrate on what it is they want to say a little bit more. And other people understand that. And what happens is when people watch it, because it's alive, as it were, they even if they're using vocabulary that is new to some of the other students, people kind of understand, or they make more of an effort to understand. So I think that's worked for me.
I did kind of an interesting lesson also earlier this year. I was helping with a public speaking class, and we didn't really have, it was the first time I ever taught public speaking, but we had to come up with some lessons for how to teach our students public speaking skills. There are a lot of ways to teach this. I took a public speaking course at my university years and years ago, and I ended up taking a lot of these ideas and sharing them with my students. But one of the things we did was that we presented a prompt to our students, and the prompt was, Ukraine is the best country in the world, and Ukrainians are the most generous and beautiful people in the world. This was our theme, this was our prompt, and this is what students had to defend. And they had to come prepared with a little speech. It was, I think, a 2-minute speech they had to have. They could add cultural aspects into it, they could bring a presentation or a PowerPoint, whatever they chose. They could even have a little class on how to teach something. Maybe they're teaching a foreigner how to make vareniki or borscht, or what the ingredients are. But it becomes a different kind of lesson very quickly, because when you have your students recording a video, and it's them explaining why Ukraine is the greatest country, they're thinking about, well, what parts of my country might I share with a foreigner?
Yeah.
What are the best parts? Is it the Carpathian Mountains? The activities you can do there? Is it Kyiv, the history of the city? Is it Lviv, the history of coffee and chocolate and bolsharino? It's like, you get students thinking about a lot of really cool things, and then for English practice, they're presenting why people should come to Ukraine, why it's a beautiful thing, why Ukrainian people are the warmest people. We had a lot of students incorporate some of their traditions that they heard from interviewing their babusia. You remember this idea that Glenn said. Interviewing the oldest member of your family, and then presenting your results in English. We had students incorporate this into their speeches about why Ukrainian babusias are the strongest people on the planet. Well, look at the life they've lived through. And they're still incredibly tough and unbelievably generous and warm when you know them personally. And to hear students give these speeches, a 2-minute speech that they prepared, they taped, they filmed, then we had a review and a peer review. They were looking at each other's. This was a really cool exercise with a rubric. And then we kind of got into evaluations. And so this was really cool because it's not like one and done, where students come to the front of the class, they prepare a paper of information, and they stand up and they recite the one page of information they have, and they sit down and they get a check mark. It's hard to say that students are really motivated personally. That's personally meaningful, interactive, or interesting for them to do. Most times I find that's just for a check or a grade. But if we have students coming into class, and I had students messaging me late at night with ideas and questions. Is it okay if I have my little brother wearing a vyshyvanka next to me in the video, and we're in the front yard with a pitchfork, and we're telling people about how to stack hay in a certain way? It's like, it was cool to receive messages like that from students, because I know this matters to them, and they're spending a lot of time trying to make the best presentation in English that they can, film it, and then we had students look at each other's. But this awkward stage exists where you hate hearing your own voice, you think you're terrible on video, but then we also looked at 3 different forms of communication. We have verbal, nonverbal, paraverbal. You break these down, and you analyze how much of nonverbal communication is important. It's 70% of all communication is nonverbal.
80 in Italy.
And there you go. You can, like you said, watch an Italian movie without words, and you can understand what's happening. But, yeah, just one moment here. But just to finish this thought, it was such a cool discovery through this idea, and it sounds similar to your idea with journalism and having your students make videos, that students are now watching each other's videos. Yes, it's a little bit awkward, uncomfortable, shy at the beginning, but we launched into this process of them really getting critical and analytical about their videos. They're listening, yes, they're catching some mistakes again, but now they're wanting to present in English with some confidence, with some flair. And it was a really cool thing. I learned a lot from this lesson, so it's a good idea. Yes, sir?
If you're interested in some my history, for 50 years ago, I studied in English school in Ukraine. And our teacher, and not teacher, but in our school, for every lesson, we have 2, 3, 5 items, such as Soviet Union is the greatest country in the world. Soviet Union is the first cosmic state in primary school in Ukraine. Am I right?
It sounds like you had very similar prompts, right? Similar assignments, but
For different
maybe
reasons.
for different reasons, it sounds like. Yeah,
Motivation.
yeah. So similar assignments, but maybe different skills that you're trying to get students to address from doing it. Yeah, you're welcome. But interesting themes, connections here from the past. But my motivation behind creating this lesson for students to present why Ukraine is the greatest country in the world and why Ukrainian people are the most generous and hospitable and just kind and warm. This was an effort because in our classes, we would have a lot of conversations about like real world problems that happen in their communities. And there's a lot of motivation that comes from these conversations. And over time, we had like these threads of kind of just not a lot of hope for kind of like job opportunities in their towns or what their future might be like or things like this. But it was a really cool, creative idea or experience for them to then turn around and now they have to kind of look at Ukraine through a foreigner's eyes. And they have to try to look for what the really cool, positive things are. And they have to take a step out of what their everyday routine is like. Maybe they see problems in the world. They're tired of riding these packed marshrutkas. You know, yes, we experience all these things. But with this assignment, now they have to kind of analyze it from a different way. And if you were a tour guide, if you were a journalist, how would you sell Ukraine to a foreigner in English? And they're actually going through this practice of trying to do it. And I was so proud of the results. These videos were amazing. They were amazing. And then we got into the process of them reviewing them and being critical and analyzing each other. And it was almost competitive, and there was a really cool spirit with it, too.
And this is why it's much better than the IELTS and Cambridge, FCE and all of that. There's no intellectual or emotional content in those exams. They're purely just sterile tests. And they have nothing to do with intellectual feeling. And therefore, they're false. And this is why people can get very high grades without actually being able to communicate very well. So this, I think, is far more valid than the traditional ESL industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so disconnected from what people really want to say and what they really want to feel. It's like you have the academic IELTS, academic FCE. It's like it's so disconnected from what real communication, real life small talk, or if you meet a foreigner for the first time, the skills and the attitude you need to really make them feel like they're warm, welcome, and you can work with them. It's so different from what these tests prepare. I completely agree with you. I think it is sterile and in a different, completely removed context. And it's not realistic to expect our students to develop in English this way. But that's what we teach. And it's like you have to kind of fight against it sometimes and think critically. What skills? How can you serve your students more? Right? So yes. Okay. Any questions about this? Contemplations. Again, I'm not. I'm just generating a few ideas for you because.
May I just ask the question? I just thought a little bit. And don't you think that our authority and government is not interested in having a great number of people who think critically? People who think critically, they are inconvenient for the government. They are not easy to control, not easy to give them some directions, yeah, and they are not good in just to control them, yeah. So that's why perhaps our educational system is so built. Yeah, it's got such structure that we have lots of information, but our students don't know how to use this information. I just have a son, and he's 10 years old, yeah, and I always try to think what skills I should develop in him just to let him know how to live in this world, yeah, not just to receive good marks at school, but I want him to develop himself and just to know how to adapt to be successful. And I see that you just said that you had a course of public speaking in Ukraine. We don't have such courses, or they are now it's good that they are available, but just you have to pay for them. But in American schools, in British schools, they are in each school, in kindergarten, the children do something like that.
In British schools, and same actually in Spanish schools, kids do lots of collective speaking activities.
And in our
They're not trained. They're kind of. I mean, a good teacher, like my kindergarten, someone's kindergarten, will just say to him, lift your head up and project your voice. But it's not an organised lesson. But they do lots of activities.
They are not afraid of. And in our
Generally
schools,
speaking,
children and even students, and even we adults, we are afraid to say something. Because we are afraid to be misunderstood, to make some mistakes, and something like that.
Yeah, we don't have that culture of being. Again, I talked about this yesterday. Being perfect. Fortunately, is receding. It's in Britain and in America as well. It's kind of almost gone. It still exists, but it's more about what creativity and self-expression, and your point about not encouraging people to think critically, which is what religion has done for centuries, and what continues to Fox News does in America, and they want you to just believe what you're fed, and so this idea is extremely radical, even though it's perfect.
Yeah.
So it's you're actually treading on a dangerous ground. No, but you could be. If this was Iran, you would be absolutely in prison.
Yeah. But part of my job here as a Peace Corps volunteer, it's like sharing Western values to an extent. It's like I can, it doesn't make me happy. It's not my passion to show up to a class of students who sit in the back of the room and who aren't ready to learn. Like, I think they've been in this system. They've been through the cycle for so long where they don't expect really to get a ton from class. They don't expect to be attached, or they don't expect it to be just to be really important for what they want in their life.
Because there's a great number of people who don't want to think critically. They feel themselves convenient because someone will think of that and make a decision, and they feel themselves comfortable for what you are saying. It seems to me. Yeah, they feel themselves comfortable in this.
Actually, there is a big difference. If you look at Catholic countries in the south of Europe and Protestant countries in the north of Europe, this is clear. Because in Catholic countries, it's, just do as you're told and you'll go to heaven and everything will be all right. Protestant countries is no, you need to take responsibility for your own soul and your own things. And it actually goes along those lines as well. So thinking critically, for Catholics, is dangerous. No, but I'm just as an example. Yeah.
But within the educational setting, it's like if I don't feel a connection to my students, if I don't feel like I'm really serving them, or they're expanding in some way, if they're not connected to what they're doing, I feel like I'm failing them. And so, yes, every lesson I teach, absolutely, God, no, it's not going to be perfect. No way. I'm learning as I go, just like I think all of us are throughout our careers, right? But my ideas, my approach, the place I'm coming from for lessons of this nature, it's if my students can feel like what they're really doing matters, and they're trained and taught how to do this up to the assignment, because yes, I'm teaching them, okay, you have your prompt, we expect that you have really good body language, good intonation, good eye contact, good posture, all these things that come along with good public speaking, besides the content. I don't see this ever addressed in Ukrainian education system, really. It's like our students don't have wonderful public presentation skills, and they absolutely need them, and there's a tremendous need for this. So having them make videos, having them watch themselves, having them feel the embarrassment of it, and then having their friends analyze it, like with a rubric. How many of you create your own rubrics for your classes? How many of you have rubrics for your classes? Of course, you have a grading scale, right? But have you ever made a rubric for a class before? It's different. It's an evaluation tool. So you have content, and you make it however you want, right? But you have whatever the skills that you expect your students to do. You have it listed of what a very good presentation should be. It's like a spectrum, and what a very bad presentation would be. And so you have different categories. You can have the content of the speech, body language, Meaning you can create it is what I'm saying, because if you exactly. And if you ask a student, okay, you have a presentation next week, I expect you to be prepared. Well, it's very vague. And a student, honestly, they don't know how to take more responsibility if they don't know what you expect of them. If you make your own rubric, yes, it's more time up front. You make a time investment to make it. It is more work at the beginning. But this is something that you can make and you can use in the future. But it will make you so much more connected to your class and your students, because when they know what you expect of them. When I made a rubric for my students in the United States, the first week of class, I would teach them the rubric. We're going through the rubric together. I'm making sure they understand it. And then also, think about grading. I see this a lot too. There's like these little kind of debates for grades, right? And you don't have like valid ground to stand on to say, why was this presentation better than this one? Why was this a 4 and this was a 4.5 or a 5? Well, you can erase a lot of this tension, right? Because there is tension in this, trying to decide grades through conversation. If you teach a rubric that you made the first week to your students, they're clear about every box, every piece of content that they're responsible for. They know how to prepare much better for this, whatever project, presentation it is. And then you'll see higher quality in what they prepare because they know what's expected of them. Maybe your students flop and fail the first time you do this, right? Then you can point to the rubric and they can clearly understand where did they fail, why did they fail. But you've seen rubrics before, of course. They're on IELTS, they're on FCE, but I think it's important that we make our own rubrics for our own classes, for our own purposes, because we can invest more to increase the quality of our classes. And I love my job more when I can do this and when I feel like my students understand what to do better. So I've found some success here. And it's a practice that I make sure that I continue, because it's just a better community of practice with my students. They ask much more informed questions. They put more effort into it, so it's a good relationship. So this is why I continue it.
But it's very important, as you said, to make sure they know what the rubric is. Otherwise, it becomes subjective, and because they might not agree with your criteria.
Sure.
But as long as they know what the criteria are,
Expect from them.
they've got a better chance of fulfilling. And instead of, because I don't really go whole grading, I don't think that helps. I think that shows people what they can't do rather than what they can. So I tend to go with a task achieved or not. And if the task isn't achieved, why not? And look into that.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, again, you're giving people this sense of you're not as good as them and they're not.
Sure.
And
it's discouraging.
It
and it's
is.
inflating. Right, and especially I think in a classroom when you share grades out loud to students, and it's like students are just coming just for the sake of the grade, to earn the grade, and that's as far as the motivation goes. It's like herein lies the problem with why it's like the grade should come after, right? We were talking about the skills, everything you expect your students to do well. They're learning the process of how you're going to, and it's good when students can disagree with the rubric. Because that means they're invested enough where they don't think this is a good skill for them to have. That means they're very in tune. They're very connected to what their future is. Because if they think, listen, this is not a good skill, I don't need this for my future, but I'd rather be evaluated on this, a student who asks that question is so much further along and invested in the educational process than a student who doesn't really care about what the rubric is or how they're graded, or if they're in it for a grade. So teaching a rubric the first few weeks of school, making sure students clearly understand what the rubric is, and having it kind of like a democracy with your class. Your class can vote on what the parts of the rubric are. There should be some debate about this, but that a class that has something like that is going to be, I think, so much more successful in getting some of these skills, really getting good presentation skills, than a class where you don't even address it at all.
And if it's a language class, I would say that teachers have to be very, very careful about what they call right or wrong.
Yes.
Particularly in English, because alternative vocabulary, different ways of expressing themselves, may not lead to the teacher's liking, but it doesn't mean they're invalid. And what happens is I see students getting marked down. I get Instagram messages about it all the time. I just got marked down for saying this, and it's wrong. It's clearly an erroneous, evaluation. So you have to be careful that just because a student doesn't use the word or the grammatical construction that you would use, doesn't mean that they're wrong.
It's not worth getting hung up on.
Yeah, but unfortunately,
It does happen, absolutely.
Well, that's why there should be some criteria according to usage to teacher that evaluates the student for them to understand the words well.
yeah.
Yeah, if I have, for example, for this you receive 5 points, and for that 10 points, then they see where the weak and strong points were. No?
I'm not sure that it's that
But I agree
sign.
that evaluation is very
It's not an exact. It's communication. It's not an exact science. It's not. I don't think you can use mathematical formula to say if I use that vocabulary as opposed to that vocabulary, that is I more than that. I don't see how that works.
But I think we can all agree that if you have two presentations that you watch, like,
Yes.
let's say a student is taught a rubric and they're taught this process and they know what to prepare for,
Yeah.
and they're taking into account nonverbal communication, eye contact, posture, intonation, inflection, all of these things that they didn't know earlier because you use the rubric as a teaching tool.
Right.
You expect them to incorporate this. What about pausing in speech? What about figurative language in speech? It's a hugely important part of speech, right? Metaphors, alliteration, repetition. It gives life, it gives speech meaning. It gives people, it's incredibly, so when you watch two presentations, one where a student's well prepared to do this, and one where a student just comes up and they just try it, yes, you're not using a mathematical formula or ticking boxes to say you're wrong here, but does one video, one presentation make way better of an impression than another? Like absolutely night and day.
I've got a question here for this, and this is for non-native teachers. Is say you have these two presentations, and one is entertaining and spontaneous and uses all of these devices, but the guy's grammar is rubbish.
Yeah.
And then somebody who is grammatically perfect, which is what everybody wants, and yet has no presentation skills at all. Who's going to get the high grade?
Great question. I think we should ask the room this question.
I'm sorry, but we are going to have an excursion.
Sure,
So can our
absolutely.
group just leave?
Yeah, but one last minute here because this last session I didn't know who would be here or if we would have a session. But so a lot of your students, are they planning to take FCE or IELTS? Are they like reaching for this goal, like from their English classes? Is this a long-term goal for them? I'm sure for some of them, the motivated ones, right? And yes, we can go on and on about how valuable these exams are, but unfortunately, like the certificate, it does things for them, and so they strive for it. But if you look at the speaking section of an exam, like FCE, okay, and if you teach a formulaic answer where students, and I've seen this happen where students try to literally memorize a rote answer, and they try to be grammatically perfect. They try to make sure that, I've had students even ask me to read their answer to questions so they can hear my pronunciation and record it and memorize it so they sound like me. It's like, this is not language, because at a job, real world skills, like they don't have anything to, it's like they're just jumping through a hoop, but they're not taking anything with them. For an exam like FCE, the speaking portion, if you have students, if you go through exercises, I think like some of these that have been mentioned that are interactive, meaningful, and important for the students, and creative. They're defending things from different perspectives. They're sharing important things about their culture for maybe Western tourists who want to discover more about Lviv. All these different little opportunities that you give them from different areas, right? This is a culmination over time. They develop as a whole to have such better speaking skills that when they sit down at an exam, like FCE or IELTS, they have so much more to offer because they've approached the language in so many different ways and they consider these things in different ways. So that's a very big, broad, I think, statement about how to do this, but I hope you took some elements of these presentations away, and I hope that you can maybe try to incorporate this into your way of teaching. And critical thinking is not a one-day thing, right? It's not like, okay, now today's the day where we're going to think critically, right? And the next week we'll go back to the textbook. No, you build it in little opportunities, and you continue this process over time. And you look for little ways, how can I make this a little bit more interactive and challenge my students' perspectives, have them defend something that they may not believe. And you kind of build in little opportunities this way, and it makes your job way more fun. And you know, it's an approach that I think we can all strive to continue putting into our lessons to value. So, okay, so I know you have an excursion. That's it for me. That's all that I have for today. Thank you very much. This wasn't a presentation, it was a conversation, and these things are valuable because when I go back, and teaching is a lonely profession, unfortunately, when you're at home and you're planning a lesson and you're thinking, what am I going to do for tomorrow, and you're scrambling, it's like collect material from experiences like these. These cards are wonderful. I encourage you to come take a look, take a picture if you'd like, get some new ideas. You can make them for whatever purpose you need them for your classes. This is very generative and constructive, and so I thank you very much for your participation and just making it valuable for me, because I'm a learner here, and I take a lot away from what you tell me. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.